Hello and welcome to my booktube channel. My name is Jimmy, and if this is your first time here, I'm really happy to have you. This is also my first time here. This is my first video, so hopefully it goes well, and hopefully this is the start of a beautiful friendship. But for this video, I'm going to go over everything I read in the month of June. I had a great reading month in June. I know we're midway through July. No one's ever accused me of being overly punctual. And because I read some great books, I want to talk about some great books. Simple as that. That said, I'll just get right into it. The first book I read in June was the 2001 novel by Percival Everett, Erasure. Percival Everett's written a few dozen novels over the last 5 decades. This novel was turned into a movie last year called American Fiction. But somehow he's completely flown under my radar all this time, until a few months ago I started noticing some booktubers I like discussing him. I'm really happy I picked this up and gave this author a chance. This is a great book, really, really good. I would say it sort of follows the tradition of novels that are novelists writing novels about novelists. In this story, our narrator and protagonist is Thelonious Monk Ellison, who is a writer of obscure and very scholarly novels that don't get a whole lot of commercial or public attention. He's a bit of a curmudgeon. He's a bit of a fish out of water. And as you can probably guess from his name, he's also an African American. He's having a lot of difficulty selling his most recent book, and he gets the feedback from his agent that publishers think his work is just not black enough to sell. This understandably incenses him, and at the same time, he witnesses the runaway commercial and critical success of a book called We Was Once From the Ghetto, which is an offensive conglomeration of every lazy stereotype about black African American life in America that you could possibly imagine. This, professional and artistic challenge that he's having right now, also combined with some financial pressures in his life, he decides that he's going to write the most ghetto novel of all. He's going to out-ghetto all the ghetto novelists. He's going to write something that is filled with so many insulting and offensive and degrading stereotypes that everyone's going to recognize it's a satire. And he sends it to his agent, and lo and behold, the publishers and Hollywood love it, and they don't quite see it as the satire that Ellison intended. And so the whole novel goes from there, and this whole setup gives a whole lot of dramatic interest and tension. And it's also quite funny at times. I can't stress enough. This is a very funny book in a very wry and ironic way. Everett makes some really interesting artistic choices in here. The foremost artistic choice, and it's a bold one, and it may turn off a lot of readers, is that he gives us the entire text of Ellison's imaginary novel, his ghetto satire, initially entitled My Pathology, and you can see it's misspelled. He gives us this whole text, and it is a doozy. It's insulting, it's offensive, it's disgusting, and it's also a page turner. I was breezing through it, just flipping through each awful thing after awful thing. In addition to that, there's a whole B plot, which is really, really well done. It involves Ellison and his family. He has a strained relationship with his siblings. His father killed himself several years before the events of this novel, and his aging mother, her health is deteriorating, as well as her memory, and she's going through cognitive decline. There's some really well done scenes, like very wrenching and emotional scenes in here as well. And what I think is cool here is that Everett is sort of contrasting the stereotype novel, like the lazy stereotypes of African American family life, with the story of Ellison's family. And it's a story that it's very unique, but its challenges and its happinesses are also universal. And I think it's really cool how Everett makes that contrast. I thought this book was really, really well done. At the end of it, I just wanted to reread it again. I thought, oh, this is going to be really good on a reread. I'm going to get a lot more out of it on the next read. And to me, that's the hallmark of a great book. Really, really recommended this. I will just say, go into this with an open mind. Like I said, our narrator, Ellison, is He's a very academic kind of guy. He's a little bit wry. So you do have to get into his voice and get through a little bit of academic digressions at times. But it's a very good book. Totally recommend. The second book I read in June was the 1955 novel The Chrysalids by the English writer John Wyndham. This is a work of science fiction. It was written in the 50s, and it's a post-apocalyptic book. So it's written while the shadow of the atomic bomb was sort of new and looming over the public conscious. Now, this takes place a few centuries after some great global-scale nuclear disaster, which probably was a war. It takes place in a rural community that sort of follows a fundamentalist Christianity with a post-apocalyptic nuclear flare. Because of this community's proximity to a vast nuclear wasteland, there's a tendency of organisms to mutate. And in this sort of vision of Christianity, they abhor anything that deviates from God's chosen image for it, i.e. any mutations. And in this community, any crops, livestock that exhibit mutations are destroyed. And any people that exhibit mutations are also dealt harshly with. And we follow it from the perspective of a boy growing up in this sort of authoritarian, isolated community. His father is very much a zealot for this version of Christianity. And this boy befriends a young girl who actually has a mutation. And that causes him to sort of reevaluate the world that he's living in, reevaluate the value system that he's grown up in. And as this story goes on, we find out that more and more about how mutations may not necessarily be visible. And it's a very atmospheric book. It moves along really quickly. I didn't quite love it at the end. Probably the last 25% of the book moves a little too fast for me and wraps things up a little too neatly. But other than that, I thought this was a very interesting and atmospheric book. It does feel very 1950s, but very, very enjoyable. Wyndham is, I think, most well known for a book called Day of the Triffids, which I haven't read. A friend of mine actually offered to lend it to me, and I turned them down because I thought it sounded dumb. I'm going to go back to them and see if I can borrow that from them this time, because I did like this, and I would like to read some more from Wyndham, especially read his most well-known work. The next book I read in June was actually my favorite. It was Spring Snow by the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. This was initially published serially in Japan in the late 60s. It was translated into English in the early 70s, and Mishima is considered one of the most important Japanese writers of the 20th century. Besides from his writing, I think he's most famous for, or infamous, for the way in which he died. He killed himself in a manner that was both spectacular and a little bit pathetic. And this was my first introduction to him as a writer. So I went into this not really having any idea what to expect. But this is a tragic love story set in the 1910s, shortly after the Russo-Japanese War. Our characters are Kiyoaki, who is a young man from a very, very wealthy, sort of merchant family, and then Satoko, a young lady from a very aristocratic family. Kiyoaki is extraordinarily beautiful. Every character in the book lets you know how beautiful Kiyoaki is, and the narrator definitely lets you know how beautiful Kiyoaki is. But he's also extremely unpleasant. They say he's sensitive, but he's very aloof, and he's not very nice. He's actually pretty nasty, and he doesn't really admit his true feelings. He and Satoko start a love affair in secret. And this novel is the story of that affair, its beginnings, its very passionate middle, and then its demise. Really, really great story. What's very cool about this is Mishima is showing you a world that 99.999% of humanity could never even imagine. These characters live in a world of unimaginable wealth, but they also live in a world of ritual and tradition that doesn't really exist much in the world anymore. And Mishima gives you a really granular look at some of the tradition. He's a beautiful writer, has an amazing ear for imagery. There's a scene where just a minor character is walking in the frost, and you can feel the crunch of the frosted grass as a character. It's so good. And this book is suffused with, you can sort of say it's very Freudian. It's sex and there's death. That's kind of the core of this book. And I think what makes it so interesting. The next book I read in June was Toni Morrison's 1998 novel, Paradise. I don't think Toni Morrison needs a whole lot of introduction. She's considered one of the greats of American literature. Won a Nobel Prize in the 90s. Her book, Beloved, is very well read in American schools. This was my introduction to her. I had never read her before this. I got it from the library, so I don't have a copy with me. And my library didn't have Beloved or Song of Solomon, which would have been my first choices to read in stock at the time. So I chose this, and I read this. I did enjoy it. The novel opens up with a scene of fairly shocking violence. And then from there, it goes back in time and shows you the history and all the characters leading up to this event, which is a pretty cool structure for the book. Well, we find out about a town called Ruby, which was formed by the families of freed slaves out in the Midwest. And this town forms a sort of all-black, sort of patriarchal, I almost want to call it a utopia, because they have a idea for how life should be, and they try to model their town after this life. So that town, Ruby, it gives us a history of Ruby. And then on the other hand, there is the convent, which is a sort of small community in a little house of a few women who they all congregate there. And these are women who live sort of on the outskirts of society, women who have had problems at home, and they're running from those problems. And they form their own community, sort of parallel to Ruby. And so we see the development of Ruby, and we see the sort of parallel life that grows in the convent. The writing in this is really well done. Morrison sort of writes in a way that reminded me of Virginia Woolf. She's in the head of one character, and then all of a sudden you're whisked away to the mind of another character. There's a pretty interesting scene that's at a wedding, and we're watching a fairly awkward wedding ceremony, and we're seeing it from the perspective of multiple people in the congregation, and we're getting their thoughts about the wedding, but their thoughts about how things are happening in the town. What's going on in this town is there's a division in this town between the elders of the town and then the youth, and then also the women of this town, and there's some disagreements on how life should be in this society. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in this book, but I didn't quite connect with most of the characters, and I found a difficult time to get into the space of this book. And then also at times, I did feel like I was getting preached at by both Morrison and by some of the characters. So I don't love getting preached at too much. But I did really enjoy parts of this book, and after reading this, I definitely want to check out Beloved and Song of Solomon. And I kind of wish I had started with those since they're a little more well-known. But regardless, this is a pretty interesting book, and I'm glad I read it. The last book I read this month was called The Language of the Night by Ursula Le Guin. This is a work of nonfiction about fiction. If you're not familiar with Ursula Le Guin, well, first of all, what the heck are you doing? But second of all, she's an absolutely legendary American science fiction fantasy writer. One of the first science fiction writers that I remember reading as a kid. I read some of the Hainish novels, as well as the Ursula books. And this is her writing about science fiction and fantasy. This is a collection of talks that she did from lectures at universities or conferences, essays that she wrote, as well as introductions to her own books that she wrote. And this is a little uneven because it is a collection from different time periods and different venues. Some of the essays go into things like Jungian psychology and Jungian archetypes and dreams, and I found some of those a little uninteresting. She's a very philosophical writer, so it's definitely at the forefront of her thinking and her writing, but I didn't find those discussions that compelling. But when she got into the craft of writing, I was really interested in a lot of these essays. There's an absolutely fantastic one called From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, which is pretty well known. I've even seen people on BookTube make videos about it. But it discusses the role of language and style in fantasy. And it's actually quite funny. She plays a very dirty trick on a poor fantasy writer of her time. And it's something you have to read to believe. I won't read it out loud. But she shows you how so much of fantasy comes from the language and the style. How the language brings you into that fantasy world. And that's something that I read some contemporary fantasy literature, and I think some writers completely have zero grasp of this. I'm not going to name any names, but Brandon Sanderson. There's other essays in this are great. She has one called From Science Fiction and Mrs. Brown, which discusses the role of character in science fiction. Now, I think at the time it may have been a little bit of a more revolutionary idea, but at the time, science fiction was not well known for having fleshed out and interesting characters. And Le Guin in this essay shows you how she wrote the novel The Dispossessed, which is an absolutely fantastic novel. It's from 1970. I think it was a Nebula winner or Hugo winner. But she shows you how she created that novel from, she had the main character, Shevek, and how she used her vision and image of that character to develop the entire novel. And it's absolutely fascinating how she goes through this. Really great stuff. One of the cool things too about this is it's almost like a sort of reading list. She brings up tons of great writers and novels that you can sort of look at and say, oh, I want to read this. That sounds interesting. So I almost see this as a little bit of a reading roadmap. And then on her last note, she has some really great reflections about The Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is something that I read several decades ago, maybe 2 decades ago. Let's not say several. I read 2 decades ago and didn't really land on me that much. I reread it again this year and I was absolutely floored. And she has some really beautiful reflections on that, and especially on the greatness of the character Smeagol or Gollum, who is actually probably my favorite character in the entire Lord of the Rings. So reading all that, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Really great book. If you're into Ursula Le Guin, you should totally read this. But if you're into like the craft of science fiction and fantasy writing, definitely totally worth checking this out. And that was everything I read in the month of June. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this. And I hope to see you again in another video, maybe in a week or so. So thanks.